Hi, I'm Joe Saunders with Miniature Landscape Hobbies, and in this episode, we're going to cover an essential technique for building a miniature. We're going to talk about dry brushing. Dry brushing is just one of those techniques that's too useful not to have in your toolbox as a painter. Depending on the scale you paint, or the subject, frequently dry brushing combined with a little layer painting is all you need. I tend to work in 1/100 scale for wargaming, and for this dry brushing is indispensable with most projects. Not all projects, but most projects. Sometimes dry brushing just is not accurate enough or subtle enough as a technique, and you need to use layer painting and glazes instead. But there are a whole host of situations that I'll go over where dry brushing does excel. First, though, we need to describe how to dry brush. Most advanced painters will tell you that there's a very specific list of considerations you need to go over in order to get the best effect. Let's take a look. First, make sure your brush is, that it's dry. If the bristles are wet, the paint will pick up moisture, and it will settle differently and streak, ruining the effect. Also, different types of brushes will perform differently. Generally, I would recommend a stiffer synthetic bristle. Second, use the paint straight from the bottle. Just as with the first point, you want the paint to sit on the bristles, not flow. You're trying to maximize the density of the pigments when you're dry brushing, so the less moisture, the better. Third, before you paint, you need to wipe most of the paint off on something like a paper towel. I'll often go a step further and test the brush on some paper or on my work surface to ensure there is just a trace of pigment there. You can always dry brush multiple layers if the effect is too subtle, but if you put too much on in one pass, then you have a real problem, and you'll have to start the paint job over again. This brings us to when you would dry brush, and there's three primary reasons why you would dry brush. First would be to do the highlights, next would be to do midtones, and last would be special cases such as weathering. When you want to imply that more light is hitting a surface by making it a brighter color, then you're highlighting. Highlighting is also probably when you would use dry brushing most often. There are actually two different ways to highlight with dry brushing, and most painters would use both interchangeably. The first is for the hard edges on a surface such as the corners of a vehicle, or my favorite, a tank. When doing this technique, you trace the exterior of the edges on the model with the side of the brush. This will deposit a light but distinct layer of pigment that will cling to just where it touches. The second version, and the one most people will use 99% of the time, is by gently flicking the brush back and forth over the surface to lightly dust pigment on that surface. If you do it right, more pigment will stick to the raised surface, creating a sort of gradient of highlighting. Also, if done right, the bristles won't reach crevices or deeper areas on the model, giving it a sort of natural shading. Midtones are anything after a base coat that you apply before the highlights. In some circumstances, dry brushing can be used here, though generally more sparingly. This is especially good for models with fine details such as 15mm infantry. I'll often give the model a darker base coat like dark brown if the model is predominantly khaki. Then I'll dry brush the midtone over top. Just remember, the model will still need a highlight, so you can go back with a super light dry brush, or more likely, a new layer of your highlight color. The other time you'll see midtones done by dry brushing is on basing or terrain. When you have a lot of heavy textures to work with, you can usually just apply more passes of the dry brush to get more of your midtone applied. Then, when highlighting, you dry brush again, just with a lighter motion and less passes of a lighter paint. This technique works best when the difference between the successive paints is more distinct, and I'll often dry brush a straight white on as a final layer on terrain, which is something you would almost never do on a vehicle or infantry model. The last application for dry brushing is for any other circumstances that aren't a highlight or a midtone, and I think this is most often used for weathering. The diffuse nature with which paint layers are spread by dry brushing looks like dust or dirt, and so a light layer of brown or beiges usually works well on wheels, tank tracks, or fenders to make your model look like it has endured some wear and tear and is not fresh off the showroom floor. To get a really good effect, try alternating stippling, which is jabbing the paint onto the model with the bristles, in combination with dry brushing. The result, I think, is quite impressive for such basic techniques. Before we wrap this video up, I'd like to give you 2 tips that go hand in hand with dry brushing. The first tip is more of a cautionary tale, and it's about metallics. Metallic paints have, unsurprisingly, metallic flecks of pigment suspended in them. And when you dry brush with it, the flecks go everywhere, introducing sparkles where you simply don't want them. If you do need to use a metallic paint, then make sure when you dry brush it that the surface is large and only metallic, or mask off areas to prevent it from being contaminated by the little silvery flecks. Better yet, get yourself a weathering pencil or a soft lead pencil like a 2B drawing pencil. I learned this trick standing in line to submit my models to the Golden Demon Awards back when Games Workshop still did Canadian events. My friend James Craig, who is an amazing award-winning model painter, showed me some Death Corps of Krieg models that he had used a pencil on to create the metallics, and the effect looked, well, more realistic than any paint I've ever seen. Now my pencils are always close at hand, but my bottle of gunmetal metallic is usually at the back of my paint drawer and is probably dried out by now. The last tip has to do with fixing the chalkiness caused by dry brushing. A lot of successive layers of dry brushing will wash the surface out, making it look pastel, and it will sometimes degrade the definition of the model. This problem, however, is easily fixed. Just go back to your mid-tone that you used before the dry brush and water it down to a glaze. Then go ahead and brush it on. It will reduce the chalkiness, although sometimes you might need more than one layer of the glaze. The other option, and in my opinion the best option, would be to get some Army Painter shader washes. These work like a glaze and also a wash at the same time, and in my experience they eliminate the chalkiness and establish the definition just fine. In my experience they only ever need one layer. And there you have it, my guide to dry brushing and some important tips. I hope this helps you with your model painting skills. That's it for this episode. Remember, Miniature Landscape Hobbies has regular content on Tuesdays and Thursdays. Make sure you subscribe and press the bell button so you get immediate notification and you don't miss out on any of our new videos. Thanks for watching, and until next time, remember to keep building life in miniature.